Hey guys, tonight we're going to dive headfirst, or maybe more accurately, barrel first, into one of those bizarre historical footnotes that just demands a closer look. Imagine, if you will, the soft glow of a few flickering candles casting long, dancing shadows on cold stone walls. The air is thick with the scent of beeswax and old parchment, perhaps a faint hint of incense lingering from morning prayers. You're cloaked in heavy wool, the silence around you broken only by the rustle of your habit or the distant chime of a bell. This is your world, circumscribed by high walls, punctuated by ritual, and largely cut off from the tumultuous world outside. This isn't just a story, it's an immersive experience, a journey back to a time where the very fabric of society was undergoing a seismic shift, and a group of women, bound by vows and routine, found themselves at the epicenter of a quiet revolution. You probably won't survive this level of historical immersion without at least a mild sense of awe, or perhaps a sudden craving for pickled herring. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling chatty, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. I always love seeing how far and wide these sleepy history lessons travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You exist within the rigid confines of the Nymptian Cistercian Convent, a place that, for many, was a sanctuary, a refuge from the harsh realities of the secular world. For others, it was a gilded cage, a decision made for them, often in their early childhood. The year is 1523. The world outside is a riot of change, innovation, and upheaval. But here, within these thick walls, time seems to flow at a different, more deliberate pace. Your days are meticulously structured. Bells dictate your rising, your prayers, your meals, your work, and your sleep. There's a calming, almost hypnotic rhythm to it all, a predictability that can either soothe your soul or slowly drive you mad, depending on your disposition. You wear the simple, unadorned habit, a uniform that erases individuality and binds you to your sisters in a shared identity. The food is plain, often meager, but sufficient. Work is practical, tending gardens, copying manuscripts, weaving, mending. There's a quiet dignity in the labor, a sense of contributing to the self-sufficiency of the community. Historians still argue whether the convents of this era were primarily places of spiritual devotion or convenient dumping grounds for unwanted daughters. What's clear, though, is that for many women, particularly those from noble families, entering a convent was one of the few respectable paths available outside of marriage. It offered a measure of intellectual stimulation, perhaps even a chance at education that was denied to most women of the time. You learned to read, to write, to chant Latin, to engage with theological texts, skills that would serve you in unexpected ways later on. The convent library, though small, might hold treasures, illuminated manuscripts, and theological treatises that you pore over in the quiet hours. There's a subtle hierarchy within the convent walls, from the venerable abbess, who governs with an iron fist wrapped in velvet, down to the newest novices, still learning the complex choreography of monastic life. You observe the unspoken rules, the subtle power dynamics, and the quiet alliances formed over shared chores or whispered confessions. It's a microcosm of the outside world, yet entirely distinct. The world beyond your walls, with its princes and peasants, its wars and its plagues, feels distant, almost unreal, like stories whispered by a traveler who has glimpsed a faraway land. You are safe here, protected, yet also utterly detached. While your days within the Nymptian convent flow with serene predictability, beyond the thick stone walls, Europe is a rumbling cauldron of discontent, a tempest brewing on the horizon, though its first gentle breezes might only just be stirring the leaves outside your window. The year, as we established, is 1523, and the seeds of what would become the Protestant Reformation have been sown, not by a king or an army, but by a monk with a hammer and a profound theological crisis. This isn't just about religious doctrine, it's about power, money, and the very structure of society. The Catholic Church, for centuries, has been the undisputed spiritual and temporal authority across Western Europe. It dictates not just how you pray, but also how you think, how you live, and, crucially, where your money goes. Think of it like a massive, ancient corporation, with branches in every town and village, a vast bureaucracy sustained by tithes, fees, and, most controversially, the sale of indulgences. You've heard whispers, perhaps, during a rare visit from a relative, or from a new novice who arrived with tales from the outside world. Tales of grievances against the Church's immense wealth, its perceived corruption, and the lavish lifestyles of some of its high-ranking clergy. It's a bit like finding out the CEO of your favorite charity just bought a private jet while you're still clipping coupons for bread. The practice of selling indulgences, essentially a get-out-of-purgatory-free card for a donation, became a particularly thorny issue. It felt less like piety and more like a transaction, a way to buy salvation, which struck many as profoundly unchristian. This widespread discontent wasn't new, mind you. For centuries, reformers had attempted to address these issues from within the Church. There were figures like Jan Hus in Bohemia, who, over a century earlier, had preached against indulgences and papal authority, only to be burned at the stake. A rather definitive way to end a debate, wouldn't you agree? But this time, something felt different. The invention of the printing press by Gutenberg in the mid-15th century meant that ideas, even radical ones, could spread like wildfire far beyond the reach of traditional authorities. A pamphlet could travel hundreds of miles faster than a horse, and its words could be devoured by hundreds of eager readers instead of just a few listeners. It's the 16th century equivalent of a viral tweet, but with much higher stakes. And for you, a woman of intellect and faith, these whispers, these fragments of information, begin to chip away at the unquestioning acceptance that has been the foundation of your entire life. The world is changing, and even the thickest stone walls cannot keep the winds of change out forever. And so, into this swirling vortex of religious and social unrest steps a figure who, for all intents and purposes, started this whole mess: Martin Luther. You've definitely heard his name, even within the confines of the convent, though likely in hushed, disapproving tones. He's often presented as a dangerous heretic, a renegade monk who dared to challenge the Pope himself. But let's rewind a bit and understand his journey. Luther wasn't some radical outsider. He was an Augustinian friar, a professor of theology at the University of Wittenberg. He was, by all accounts, a devout and brilliant scholar, deeply tormented by questions of salvation. He spent years wrestling with the concept of God's justice, convinced that no matter how many good works he performed, he could never be righteous enough to earn divine favor. It was a spiritual struggle that consumed him, driving him to ever greater acts of piety, yet leaving him in profound despair. It's like trying to fill a bucket with a hole in it. No matter how much effort you put in, you just can't seem to get it full. His breakthrough, famously known as the Tower Experience, came as he studied the Epistle to the Romans, specifically the verse, "The righteous shall live by faith." It hit him like a lightning bolt. Salvation wasn't earned through human effort, indulgences, or even good deeds, but was a free gift from God, received through faith alone. This concept, known as sola fide, by faith alone, was utterly revolutionary. It undercut centuries of church teaching and practice, essentially rendering many of its rituals and intermediaries obsolete. If you could simply believe and be saved, what need was there for popes, priests, or even elaborate monastic orders? It's like discovering you could stream your favorite show directly rather than having to rent a VHS tape from a very expensive and bossy video store owner. Now, Luther initially didn't intend to break away from the church. He wanted to reform it from within. His famous act of nailing the 95 Theses to the door of the Castle Church in Wittenberg on October 31, 1517, was an academic challenge, a scholarly debate invitation. He was calling for a discussion, particularly on the abuses of indulgences, which were being aggressively marketed by a Dominican friar named Johann Tetzel with catchy slogans like, "As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs." Classy, right? But the printing press, bless its noisy, ink-stained heart, got involved. Copies of Luther's theses spread like wildfire across Germany, translated from Latin into German, sparking widespread public debate and outrage. The Pope, Leo X, initially dismissed Luther as a drunken German who will amend his ways when sober. Oops. What followed was a series of debates, condemnations, and eventually Luther's excommunication in 1521. He refused to recant his writings at the Diet of Worms, famously stating, "Here I stand, I can do no other." This moment cemented his defiance and marked a definitive break. His ideas, articulated in pamphlets and sermons, weren't just theological. They were deeply appealing to people tired of church corruption and eager for a more direct, personal relationship with God. He also challenged the authority of the Pope and argued for sola scriptura, by Scripture alone, meaning the Bible was the ultimate authority, not church tradition or papal decrees. This was another huge shift, empowering individuals to read and interpret the Bible for themselves, rather than relying solely on the clergy. It's like giving everyone a map and a compass, rather than just telling them to follow the guy in the fancy hat. For you, in the quiet of Nimschen, the details of Luther's defiance might be murky, filtered through rumor and fear. But the essence of his message, that salvation is a gift, not a transaction, and that a direct connection to God is possible, starts to permeate the protective bubble of your convent. Historians still argue whether Luther was primarily a theologian driven by spiritual conviction or a strategic genius who brilliantly leveraged emerging technologies and widespread discontent. Perhaps he was both. Regardless, his unconventional path had opened a door that many, including a group of cloistered nuns, would soon realize they yearned to walk through. The rigid, ordered world you've always known is about to receive some very unsettling news. Now, let's shift our gaze from the grand, turbulent currents of European history to a very specific, quiet life that will soon be swept up in them. You are Katharina von Bora, and your story, even before the famous escape, is a microcosm of the options, or lack thereof, available to young women of your time. You entered the Cistercian convent of Nimschen, near Grimma in Saxony, at a tender age, likely around 10 years old. Your family, minor nobility, had many children, and placing a daughter in a convent was a common, often practical solution. It ensured you'd be cared for, educated, and maintain a certain social standing, even if it meant sacrificing the possibility of marriage and a family of your own. It was a secure future, if not a personally chosen one. Imagine being sent away from your home, perhaps just a small manor house, to a vast, echoing stone structure, filled with solemn women in dark habits. The transition must have been disorienting, to say the least. You spent years within those walls, growing from a quiet child into a young woman. Your days, as we've established, were defined by routine. Early morning prayers before the sun had fully risen, communal meals in silence, hours spent in the scriptorium copying texts, or in the gardens, tending to herbs and vegetables. You learned Latin, the language of scripture and scholarly discourse. You chanted psalms, your voice blending with the voices of your sisters, filling the cold chapel with resonant sound. You were educated, perhaps more so than many women of your social standing who remained in the secular world. The convent offered a unique kind of intellectual refuge. You weren't just learning rote prayers, you were engaging with complex theological ideas, even if those ideas were firmly rooted in traditional Catholic doctrine. You became literate, a skill that would prove invaluable later on. Katharina, by all accounts, was not a wilting flower. She was described as intelligent, practical, and possessing a strong will, qualities that must have chafed, even subtly, against the strictures of monastic life. There's a certain independent spirit that emerges from the historical record, even through the limited accounts of her early life. You, as Katharina, observed the world around you from within the convent's bubble, a world slowly being reshaped by forces you could only dimly perceive. The abbess, a woman of authority and tradition, would have been vigilant, ensuring that no dissenting ideas penetrated the spiritual sanctuary. Yet, even the most diligent gatekeepers cannot entirely prevent the flow of information, particularly when that information is carried on the very winds of change. The conventional path for women, particularly those of noble birth, was marriage, a carefully arranged union to secure family alliances, property, or status. But for those like Katharina who entered the convent, that path was sealed. For centuries, the religious life was seen as a noble calling, a spiritual marriage to Christ. Many women truly embraced it, finding profound peace and purpose in their vows. But for others, it was a practical necessity, a duty, or even a banishment. Historians still debate whether women in convents had more agency and intellectual freedom than their married counterparts in certain respects. On the one hand, they were cloistered and subject to strict rules. On the other, they avoided the dangers of childbirth, the subservience to a husband, and the often brutal realities of managing a secular household. You might have seen some of your sisters find genuine solace and spiritual fulfillment in their vows, while others, perhaps the younger ones, seemed to pine for a world they could barely remember. The sounds of birds outside, the scent of fresh rain on the fields beyond the wall, these sensations would have been a constant, gentle reminder of a different kind of existence. Your life, Katharina, was one of disciplined devotion, of quiet contemplation, and of communal living. You were bound by your vows, your routine, and the ancient traditions of your order. But the world outside, with its theological earthquakes and social tremors, was about to send ripples right through your serene, structured existence. And those ripples would very soon turn into waves, crashing against the very foundation of the life you knew. The disciplined calm of the Nimshan convent was a well-maintained facade, a meticulous arrangement of stones and habits designed to keep the world out. But even the sturdiest walls eventually succumbed to sustained pressure, and the pressure building in Germany was immense. The whispers about Martin Luther and his revolutionary ideas began to penetrate, not as shouts, but as faint, persistent echoes carried on the wind. You, as Katharina, and your fellow nuns initially heard them as distorted rumors, fragments of unsettling news from the outside world. Perhaps a new novice, arriving from a more bustling town, spoke of preachers railing against indulgences in the marketplace, or of common folk openly discussing the Bible in German, something previously unimaginable. It's like hearing faint music from a distant party when you're stuck doing chores. You can't quite make out the lyrics, but the rhythm is definitely different. These new ideas, however incomplete or censored, planted tiny seeds of doubt. Luther's central tenets, that salvation was a gift of God's grace through faith alone, and that Scripture, not papal decree, was the ultimate authority, were fundamentally at odds with the very purpose of your monastic life. If good works didn't earn salvation, what was the point of your endless prayers, your strict fasting, your rigorous self-denial? If a direct relationship with God was possible through faith, what was the role of the Church's vast hierarchy, or indeed of the convent itself? It was a theological earthquake, shaking the very foundations of your spiritual understanding. Imagine being told that the entire system you've dedicated your life to is, well, not quite right. It would be disorienting, to say the least. The abbess, no doubt, attempted to control the flow of information, perhaps forbidding talk of these heresies or confiscating any pamphlets that might make their way in. She would emphasize the importance of obedience, tradition, and the sanctity of your vows. But curiosity, as they say, killed the cat, and it certainly stirred things up among the nuns. You might have seen some of the older nuns recoil in horror at the very mention of Luther's name, viewing him as an agent of the devil. But for others, especially the younger, more intellectually curious ones, these ideas sparked hope, or at least a deep-seated desire for more information. The convent library, usually a place of quiet study and pious contemplation, might have become a subtle battleground of ideas. While outwardly studying traditional texts, your mind might have secretly grappled with the implications of Luther's challenges. The Latin you mastered, meant for reciting prayers, could now be used to decipher texts that, though perhaps orthodox, might lead you to question your own interpretations. The very skills you honed in service to the Church now offered tools for independent thought. It's a classic case of unintended consequences, like teaching someone to build a magnificent cage only for them to use the tools to pick the lock. Historians still argue whether the initial discontent among the nuns was primarily spiritual, driven by a genuine theological awakening, or if it was also fueled by a desire for personal freedom and a rejection of the constraints of convent life. Perhaps it was a complex blend of both. For a woman like Katharina, who had been placed in the convent so young, the allure of a different life, one where she might choose her own path, even marry and have children, must have been incredibly powerful, a flickering light in the darkness of her predestined existence. The fact that a respected monk, a man of God, was questioning the very institution they served gave intellectual and spiritual justification to their nascent desires for change. The seeds of discontent, once planted, began to sprout in the fertile ground of their hidden hopes and unspoken questions. The serene rhythm of the convent, once a comfort, now felt like a cage, and the whispers from the outside world grew louder, promising a very different kind of song. The internal stirrings of doubt and curiosity within the Nimshin convent were not merely academic. They eventually led to action, albeit discreet and fraught with risk. Imagine the hushed conversations, perhaps during a rare moment of unsupervised work in the laundry, or a whispered exchange in the dark chapel after Compline. The longing for more information, for a tangible connection to this new movement, grew stronger. These women, cloistered for years, perhaps decades, were desperate to understand the full scope of what was happening beyond their walls. It's like being in a sealed room and suddenly hearing a fascinating podcast playing faintly outside. You just have to know what they're talking about. Their isolation made direct contact nearly impossible. The abbess maintained a tight grip on communication, scrutinizing all incoming and outgoing letters. Visitors were rare and monitored. Yet the desire for genuine knowledge, for a direct appeal, festered. It became clear that if they were to truly understand and perhaps act upon these new ideas, they needed an intermediary, someone on the outside who believed in Luther's reforms and was willing to take enormous risks on their behalf. This wasn't just about theological debate, it was about the very real possibility of freedom, of choice, of reclaiming lives that had been decided for them. The nuns, driven by this desperate hope, concocted a plan. They would draft a letter, a plea for help, addressed not to a local nobleman or a family member, but directly to Martin Luther himself. This was an audacious move, a direct challenge to the authority of their abbess and the very institution of the convent. To reach Luther, who was already a controversial figure with a target on his back, required incredible courage and a bit of luck. The letter would outline their grievances, their spiritual yearning for the pure word of God, and their desire to leave the monastic life, which they now saw as contrary to true Christian faith. They were, in essence, seeking a theological justification for breaking their vows. It's a bit like sending a desperate email to a celebrity, hoping against all odds they'll actually read it and respond. But how to get the letter out, and to whom could they entrust such a dangerous mission? The answer lay in the very mundane necessities of convent life. Convents, like any large household, needed supplies. They relied on merchants who regularly traveled between towns, bringing in goods like food, textiles, and, perhaps most importantly for this story, provisions like pickled fish. These merchants, often overlooked and underestimated, moved with a freedom denied to most, possessing a network of contacts and a familiarity with the roads and back alleys of Saxony. You can imagine the tension involved in this secret operation. The furtive glances exchanged, the hurried whispers, the letter itself carefully folded and hidden in a pocket or beneath a habit. The very act of writing it was a transgression, a betrayal of their vows of obedience. They were putting their faith not just in Luther's teachings, but in the trustworthiness of an unknown merchant, a man who, if caught, could face severe penalties for aiding and abetting heretics. Historians still argue about the precise motivations of every nun involved in this secret correspondence. Was it pure faith, a longing for freedom, or a combination of both? Whatever the individual drivers, their collective desire for change pushed them to this extraordinary act of defiance. This risky endeavor, this clandestine communication, was the first real step on a path that would lead them far beyond the quiet walls of Nimshin into a world they could scarcely imagine. The desperate plea from the nuns of Nimshin needed a hero, or at least a very brave, very discreet delivery person. And as is often the case in history, the most pivotal roles are sometimes played by the most unassuming individuals. Enter Leonhard Kappe, a quiet, reliable burgher from Torgau, a town not far from the convent. Kappe was a merchant, specifically dealing in the rather pungent but highly necessary business of supplying herring. He moved goods, including barrels of preserved fish, between towns, making him an ideal, if utterly improbable, choice for a clandestine mission. He possessed the kind of routine, unremarkable presence that allowed him to slip through society's cracks without drawing undue attention. Think of him as the 16th century equivalent of a low-key delivery driver, except instead of packages, he's ferrying desperate pleas for freedom. The nuns, having secretly composed their letter to Martin Luther, found a way to discreetly pass it to Kappe. The specifics are lost to time, but you can imagine the quiet tension of that exchange. A furtive glance, a quick handoff, the heavy weight of the secret now resting in the merchant's calloused palm. Why would Kappe risk so much for a group of cloistered women? He was a supporter of Luther's reforms, drawn to the promise of a more direct, unburdened faith. He believed in the righteousness of their cause, seeing their plight not as a simple breach of vows, but as a spiritual awakening. His conscience, and perhaps a healthy dose of anti-establishment sentiment, drove him to action. He understood the enormous personal danger he was undertaking. Aiding heretics and facilitating the escape of nuns was a serious offense, punishable by imprisonment, torture, or even death. This wasn't a game. It was a matter of life and death, both for him and for the women he was helping. Kappe accepted the mission, his sturdy frame and unassuming demeanor belying the immense courage within. He delivered the letter to Luther in Wittenberg. Imagine Luther's reaction receiving this desperate missive from a group of cloistered nuns. He was already the most controversial figure in Germany, constantly under threat, excommunicated, and declared an outlaw. Yet he was deeply moved by their plight. He recognized the sincerity of their spiritual struggle and the injustice of their forced confinement. Luther, having himself broken his monastic vows, felt a profound responsibility to assist them. He understood that these women were not simply looking for an escape from mundane life. They were seeking spiritual liberation, a chance to live according to the pure Word of God as he understood it. A mainstream historical fact often overlooked is the sheer logistics and danger of communication in this era. There was no postal service as we know it, no encrypted messaging. Every letter was a tangible object, a physical manifestation of a thought, carried by hand, vulnerable to interception, weather, and bandits. The trust placed in individuals like Kappe was immense. A quippy tidbit, it's said that some of the nuns specifically mentioned in their letter that they were unhappy and that their souls yearned for true Christian freedom. It wasn't just a general complaint, it was a heartfelt plea for spiritual and personal autonomy. Historians still argue whether Kappe acted purely out of religious conviction or if there was some financial incentive, however small, for his dangerous service. Perhaps it was a mixture, as is often the case with human motivations. Regardless, his willingness to step into this precarious role made him an indispensable link in a chain of events that would become legend. With Luther now fully aware of their situation and actively seeking a solution, the stage was set for the next, even more audacious phase of the plan. The quiet delivery of a letter had ignited a spark, and soon a blaze for freedom would follow. With Luther now aware of the nuns' desperate situation, the conversation shifted from quiet pleas to daring logistics. The question was no longer if the nuns would escape, but how. And this is where the story takes a truly peculiar, almost unbelievable turn, elevating it from a simple act of defiance to a legend that has captivated imaginations for centuries. The solution was hatched, a plan so audacious, so utterly bonkers, it could only have been born out of sheer desperation and a touch of Luther's unconventional thinking. The nuns would escape in herring barrels. Yes, you heard that right. Not secret tunnels, not forged passes, not even a daring horseback ride under the cover of darkness. Pickled fish barrels. It's the kind of plan that, if it were pitched in a modern heist movie, you'd roll your eyes and think, come on, that's too ridiculous. But this was the 16th century, and necessity, combined with a healthy dose of ingenuity, truly was the mother of invention. Leonhard Kopp, our intrepid fish merchant, became the linchpin of this extraordinary scheme. He regularly delivered provisions, including large barrels of salted herring, to the convent. These barrels were tall, sturdy, and, crucially, large enough to conceal a person if that person was willing to endure extreme discomfort. Imagine the discussions, the hushed planning meetings between Kopp and Luther. How many barrels would they need? How would they get the nuns inside without arousing suspicion? How would they transport them out of the convent, past the vigilant eyes of the gatekeepers, and then over miles of bumpy roads? The smell alone would have been a significant challenge. Think about it, days, possibly weeks of herring fumes seeping into your clothes, your hair, your very pores. It's enough to make you swear off seafood for life, or at least anything that comes in a barrel. The date was set, Easter Eve, April 7th, 1523. This was a strategically chosen time. The holiday would mean increased activity, perhaps a slight relaxation of vigilance, and the focus of the community would be on religious observances, not on scrutinizing every cart leaving the convent gates. Under the cover of dusk, Kopp arrived at the convent with his usual delivery of empty barrels, ready to be refilled with next season's catch. But this time, a secret compartment, perhaps a false bottom, or simply enough room to squeeze a person in with minimal discomfort, had been prepared in some of them. The moment of truth arrived. In the dead of night, one by one, a group of 12 nuns, including Katharina von Bora, silently prepared for their escape. They shed their habits, donning simpler, more secular clothes that would allow them to blend in on the outside. Imagine the mixture of fear and exhilaration as they crammed themselves into those claustrophobic wooden containers. The air would have been stale, heavy with the lingering scent of brine and fish. It's enough to make you swear off seafood for life, or at least anything that comes in a barrel. The date was set, Easter Eve, April 7th, 1523. This was a strategically chosen time. The
The holiday would mean increased activity, perhaps a slight relaxation of vigilance. And the focus of the community would be on religious observances, not on scrutinizing every cart leaving the convent gates. Under the cover of dusk, Kopp arrived at the convent with his usual delivery of empty barrels, ready to be refilled with next season's catch. But this time, a secret compartment, perhaps a false bottom, or simply enough room to squeeze a person in with minimal discomfort, had been prepared in some of them. The moment of truth arrived. In the dead of night, one by one, a group of 12 nuns, including Katharina von Bora, silently prepared for their escape. They shed their habits, donning simpler, more secular clothes that would allow them to blend in on the outside. Imagine the mixture of fear and exhilaration as they crammed themselves into those claustrophobic wooden containers. The air would have been stale, heavy with the lingering scent of brine and fish. Every creak of the wagon, every bump in the road would have sent a jolt of panic through them, the fear of discovery ever present. Historians still argue about the exact number of nuns who escaped that night. Some sources say 12, others mention 13. The discrepancy likely arises from the fragmented nature of the historical records and the need for absolute secrecy. What is certain, however, is that it was a significant number, a large portion of the convent's occupants, indicating a widespread desire for change. This wasn't just a handful of disgruntled individuals, it was a mass exodus, a collective act of rebellion. A quirky tidbit, it said that one of the nuns was initially too large to fit.
Section 9. Imagine, if you can, the sheer, unimaginable discomfort of that journey. You're crammed into a damp, brine-scented wooden barrel, the lid secured above you, plunging you into absolute darkness. The air is stale, thick with the lingering aroma of pickled herring, a smell that, even centuries later, you can practically feel in your nostrils. Every lurch of the wagon, every bump in the uneven 16th century road sends you crashing against the rough interior, or worse, against the sides of the barrel, jostling your knees and elbows. It's like being in the world's worst, most odoriferous roller coaster, only you can't see where you're going and there's no immediate end in sight. You try to breathe shallowly, conserving the precious air, while your ears strain for any sound from outside. The creak of the wheels, the snorts of the horses, the hushed voices of Kappa and his men, and, most terrifyingly, the approach of other travelers. The journey was long, perhaps a full day and night, or even longer. From Nimschen to Wittenberg, a distance of about 30 miles, roughly 50 kilometers, might not seem far on a modern map. But in a 16th century wagon with secret human cargo, it was an arduous, dangerous undertaking. The roads were rarely paved, often little more than muddy tracks carved by centuries of carts and hooves. Bandits were a constant threat, and any stop could mean discovery. The sheer resilience of these women, enduring such physical and mental torment for the sake of freedom, is truly astounding. You find yourself focusing on small things to distract from the claustrophobia: the rhythm of the wagon, the distant call of a bird, the faint sound of a river. You try to recall prayers, not out of spiritual devotion now, but as a distraction, a way to occupy a mind that screams for light and fresh air. The danger of discovery was paramount. Imagine a sudden stop. What would Kappa say if challenged by a curious guard or a suspicious passerby? Just a normal load of fish, nothing to see here. If the barrels were opened, if the secret was revealed, the consequences for everyone involved would be severe. Imprisonment, public humiliation, perhaps even execution. For the nuns, it would mean being dragged back to the convent, facing harsh punishment, perhaps even life in a stricter, more punitive confinement. The stakes couldn't have been higher. A mainstream historical fact often forgotten in the romanticized versions of escapes is the sheer physical endurance required. These were not pampered ladies, they were women accustomed to a hard life, which perhaps served them well in this extreme situation. A quirky tidbit: the smell of pickled herring is notoriously strong and tends to linger. One can only imagine the aroma that must have accompanied Kappa's wagon as it trundled through the countryside. It probably served as a natural deterrent to anyone getting too close, a kind of pungent cloaking device.
Historians still argue whether the escape was meticulously planned down to every detail, or if it was more a series of desperate improvisations driven by immediate necessity. The truth likely lies somewhere in between, a testament to quick thinking and a healthy dose of luck. Finally, after what must have felt like an eternity, the wagon comes to a halt. You hear the familiar sounds of a busy town, the murmur of voices, the clang of a blacksmith, the distant barking of a dog. Hope flares within you, a fragile, almost unbelievable sensation. Then, a creak as the lid is lifted. A gasp of fresh air, albeit still tinged with fish, fills your lungs. The blessed light, even if it's just the muted glow of dawn, washes over your face. You cautiously emerge, stiff and disoriented, blinking against the sudden brightness. You are free. You are in Wittenberg. The journey in the pickle barrel is over, but an entirely new, unpredictable journey is just beginning.
Emerging from the darkness of a herring barrel into the bustling, vibrant world of Wittenberg must have been an overwhelming sensory explosion. The smells, not just of fish, but of baking bread, wood smoke, manure, and unwashed humanity, would have been a stark contrast to the sterile, incense-tinged air of the convent. The sounds, the clamor of carts, the shouts of merchants, the chatter of townsfolk would have replaced the hushed solemnity of monastic life. You're blinking in the daylight, disoriented, perhaps a little stiff, but utterly free. It's a surreal moment, like stepping out of a time capsule, or perhaps more accurately, out of a very smelly wooden sardine can. Luther, having orchestrated this daring rescue, understood that these women, now runaway nuns, were in a precarious position. They had no immediate family to return to, as their families, staunchly Catholic, would likely view them as disgraced or even as dangerous heretics. They had no money, no property, and no social standing outside the convent. Their skills, refined for monastic life, chanting, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, were not immediately transferable to the demands of a secular 16th century town. It was a bit like being dropped into the middle of a completely new country with no passport, no money, and no idea where the nearest Wi-Fi hotspot is. Luther, ever the pragmatist, immediately set about finding suitable homes and occupations for them. He reached out to wealthy, sympathetic families in Wittenberg and the surrounding areas, many of whom were already adherents of his reformist ideas. These families, often eager to support the burgeoning Protestant movement, provided lodging, food, and employment for the former nuns. This was not always easy. Many of these women had spent their entire lives cloistered, and the transition to secular life, with its different social rules, domestic responsibilities, and lack of constant supervision, must have been incredibly challenging. Imagine trying to navigate a supermarket for the first time after only ever having grown your own food. The dispersal was gradual. Some found work as housekeepers, tutors, or companions. Others, particularly those from noble families, might have found positions more befitting their former status. The goal was to integrate them safely and productively into the Protestant community, providing them with a new sense of purpose and stability. Luther tirelessly advocated for them, writing letters, making appeals, and ensuring their well-being. He saw it not just as a humanitarian effort, but as a symbolic victory for the Reformation. Proof that monastic vows were not unbreakable, and that a truer, more evangelical path was open to those who sought it. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the nuns eventually married, often to local scholars, pastors, or craftsmen who were also sympathetic to the Reformation. Marriage for former nuns was a significant statement, openly defying the Catholic Church's insistence on lifelong celibacy for religious orders. It was a tangible manifestation of the Reformers' belief that marriage was a holy state, open to all, including former clergy. A quirky tidbit, one of the escaped nuns, the aforementioned larger sister, was said to have a particularly difficult time finding a suitable match, possibly due to her strong personality or perhaps simply the limited options available at the time.
She eventually found a husband, proving there truly is someone for everyone, even if you've recently emerged from a fish barrel. Historians still argue about the extent to which these women actively chose to leave the convent versus being influenced by Luther's growing movement and the promise of a more fulfilling married life. It was likely a spectrum, with some driven purely by spiritual conviction and others by a desire for personal autonomy. For Katharina von Bora, the dispersal meant a temporary stay with the family of the town clerk, a highly respected figure in the community. She was now free, but her future remained a blank slate, waiting for the strokes of destiny.
So, you've emerged from the barrel, blinking in the Wittenberg light, and found yourself in a new household. For Katharina von Bora, this meant a period of adjustment, a quiet but profound transformation from cloistered nun to independent woman in a rapidly changing world. The convent, despite its restrictions, had provided a clear structure, a defined role. Now you were navigating a world that offered more freedom but demanded more self-reliance. It's like suddenly getting a map to a vast, unexplored territory after years of walking the same few corridors. Exciting, yes, but also a little daunting. Katharina, now living with the family of the town clerk, was no longer bound by monastic vows. But she still faced the societal expectations of a single woman in the 16th century. Without family support or an established role, options were limited. She, along with the other escaped nuns, became a subject of great interest and discussion in Wittenberg. Luther, having taken on the responsibility for their well-being, was actively involved in their future, playing a kind of matchmaker, seeking suitable husbands for them among his followers. He believed strongly that marriage was the proper, God-ordained state for both men and women, and saw it as a legitimate and honorable path for former clergy. This wasn't just a practical solution, it was a theological statement, a direct counterpoint to the Catholic Church's emphasis on celibacy for priests and nuns. For Katharina, a woman of strong will and practical skills, the idea of a prearranged marriage, even to a Lutheran sympathizer, might have felt somewhat familiar to the old ways, albeit without the convent as the alternative. She had a keen intellect and a practical nature, qualities that would serve her well. She observed the workings of a secular household, learning the rhythms of managing a home, supervising servants, and participating in the daily life of a busy town. This was a stark departure from the quiet, contemplative life of the convent, where communal chores were divided and structured by rule. Now, the responsibility was more direct, the decisions more personal. You're no longer just following instructions, you're making choices, however small. She was also exposed daily to the vibrant intellectual and religious ferment of Wittenberg, the heart of the Reformation. Luther's sermons, often fiery and passionate, would have been a constant presence. Discussions about theology, about the role of faith, scripture, and the individual's relationship with God were not confined to scholarly circles, but permeated daily life. You might have found yourself listening intently, comparing these new doctrines to the teachings you had received in the convent, solidifying your conviction in the path you had chosen. It was a rapid education in the practicalities of a new faith and a new way of life. A mainstream historical fact is that many of the women who left convents during the Reformation struggled to find new roles and livelihoods. The shift was often difficult, and not all stories ended as successfully as Katharina's. A quirky tidbit, Katharina was apparently quite direct and perhaps a little picky when it came to potential suitors. She rejected several proposals that Luther put forward, making her preferences known. She wasn't just going to marry anyone, she had a mind of her own, a trait that clearly stood out even then. Historians still argue whether Katharina's initial resistance to certain matches was due to her strong personality, a desire for a particular kind of partner, or simply a woman asserting what little agency she had in a world that still largely dictated her choices. Whatever the reason, her refusal to simply accept the first available option showcases her independent spirit, a trait that would soon lead her to an unexpected and globally significant union.
She was no longer just a former nun. She was Katharina von Bora, navigating her own path in a new world, and her journey was about to intersect with the very person who had set her free.
And then, inevitably, a most unlikely connection began to form. You, Katharina von Bora, the former nun, found yourself increasingly in the orbit of Martin Luther, the very man whose radical ideas had shattered your old world and set you on this new, uncertain path. He was a towering figure, both physically and intellectually, a man whose pronouncements could shake kingdoms. He was also, at this point, deeply committed to advocating for the former nuns, ensuring their well-being and finding them suitable partners. It's almost too neat, isn't it? The rescuer and the rescued, their paths now converging beyond mere obligation. Luther, in his mid-40s at the time, was a controversial and highly visible public figure, constantly battling theological adversaries and political pressures. He was, by his own admission, not a man given to romantic notions, often joking about the unsuitability of a former monk marrying a former nun. Yet, as he interacted with Katharina, a different picture began to emerge. She was pragmatic, intelligent, and strong-willed, qualities that he, perhaps surprisingly, admired. She was not a shrinking violet, easily intimidated by his formidable intellect or his fame. She could hold her own in a conversation, and her practical skills were evident as she helped manage the household where she was staying. Initially, Luther had tried to arrange marriages for Katharina with others, including a pastor named Caspar Glatz. But Katharina, as we touched on earlier, was quite particular. She flatly rejected Glatz, famously stating that she would only marry Luther himself or his colleague Nikolaus von Amsdorf. This was a bold declaration for a woman in her position, essentially calling her shot with two of the most prominent figures of the Reformation. It's like being set up on a series of blind dates and then announcing, "Actually, I'd prefer to go out with the host of the show." This declaration reportedly caught Luther off guard, but it also seemed to pique his interest. He saw in Katharina not just a former nun in need of a husband, but a formidable woman with a sharp mind and a resilient spirit. His friends and colleagues initially resisted the idea, fearing that such a marriage would be scandalous, provide ammunition for their Catholic opponents, and detract from the seriousness of the Reformation. A monk and a nun? The very idea, they probably exclaimed, clutching their pearls and fanning themselves dramatically. It would be a living embodiment of everything the Catholic Church accused them of, breaking sacred vows, indulging in carnal desires, and disrespecting tradition. But Luther, once his mind was set, was not easily swayed by public opinion or the concerns of his peers. He saw the potential for his marriage to be a powerful living testament to the principles of the Reformation, that marriage was honorable for all, that vows taken under duress could be broken, and that a new, God-ordained path was open. He also likely realized on a personal level that Katharina was precisely the kind of partner he needed. She was practical, capable, and understood the unique pressures of their shared, tumultuous world. She wasn't afraid to speak her mind, a quality that might have been challenging for some, but refreshing for a man constantly surrounded by sycophants. A mainstream historical fact is that Martin Luther was one of the first prominent reformers to marry, openly defying the Catholic Church's tradition of clerical celibacy. This act set a powerful precedent for future Protestant clergy. A quirky tidbit is that Luther himself often referred to Katharina as my rib or my Katie, indicating a blend of affection and perhaps a touch of exasperation at his strong will. Historians still argue whether Luther's decision to marry Katharina was primarily a theological statement or a genuine, if unexpected, romantic connection. Perhaps, as with many of his pivotal life choices, it was a profound blend of both. Regardless, the stage was now set for one of the most historically significant and surprisingly endearing marriages of the 16th century. On June 13, 1525, barely 2 years after her barrel-bound escape, you, Katharina von Bora, found yourself standing beside Martin Luther, exchanging vows in a simple ceremony in Wittenberg. This wasn't a grand, lavish affair. It was a rather understated event, held in the evening, with only a few close friends and witnesses present. It was a practical union, yes, a statement of defiance, absolutely, but it also blossomed into something genuinely tender and deeply impactful. This marriage, a former monk and a former nun, was a revolutionary act in itself, shattering centuries of tradition and setting a powerful precedent for the Protestant Reformation. Imagine the whispers, the shockwaves it sent through both Catholic and Protestant circles. It was, to put it mildly, the talk of Europe. You, Katharina, now became the lady of the Luther household, a bustling former Augustinian monastery that had been gifted to Martin. This wasn't a quiet little cottage. It was a large, sprawling complex in various states of disrepair, with numerous rooms, an extensive garden, and even a brewery. Your practical nature and strong organizational skills were immediately put to the test. Martin Luther was a brilliant theologian, but by all accounts, he was not a domestic wizard. He often had students, colleagues, and visitors staying with them, sometimes dozens at a time, turning their home into a combination of a guest house, a lecture hall, and a theological commune. It was a bit like running a perpetual, slightly chaotic bed and breakfast, except your main guest is a theological rock star constantly challenging the Pope. Katharina took on the monumental task of managing this large household. She oversaw the brewing of beer, a crucial task in 16th century Germany, the tending of the extensive gardens that supplied their food, the raising of livestock, and the overall finances of the family. She transformed the chaotic monastery into a thriving, self-sufficient home. Her efforts allowed Luther the freedom to focus on his prodigious writing, preaching, and teaching. She was his anchor, his chief of staff, and his domestic commander-in-chief. It's hard to overstate her contribution to Luther's ability to do his work. Without her steady hand, his life would likely have been far more disorganized. Their marriage was, by all accounts, a loving partnership, albeit one with its share of everyday spats and disagreements. Luther often spoke of his affection for "my Katie," and his letters reveal a deep respect for her intelligence and capabilities. They had 6 children together: Hans, Elizabeth, Magdalena, Martin, Paul, and Margarita. You experience the joys and sorrows of parenthood, the sleepless nights with infants, the laughter of growing children, and the heartbreaking loss of 2 daughters, Elizabeth and Magdalena, in childhood. These personal tragedies deeply affected both of them, forging an even stronger bond of shared grief and comfort. A mainstream historical fact is that the Luther marriage became a model for Protestant clerical marriages, demonstrating that a domestic life, far from being a distraction from spiritual pursuits, could be a source of strength and blessing. It normalized marriage for ministers and their families. A quirky tidbit: Katharina was known for her excellent beer, which was apparently quite popular among Luther's students and visitors. He even once remarked that he trusted her brewing more than his own theology sometimes. Historians still argue about the true nature of their relationship, whether it was an intellectual partnership above all, a deeply affectionate bond, or simply a pragmatic arrangement that evolved into love. Likely, it was all of these things. What is undeniable is that Katharina von Bora was far more than just Luther's wife. She was a shrewd businesswoman, a devoted mother, and a vital force behind the scenes of the Reformation. Her marriage solidified not just her own freedom, but the very image of the new Protestant family, a direct challenge to the old order. The story of the escaped nuns of Nimschen, and particularly Katharina von Bora's journey, didn't end with her marriage to Luther. In fact, it only truly cemented its place in history, becoming a powerful symbol of the broader Reformation itself. Their audacious escape, initially a desperate bid for personal freedom, resonated across Europe, echoing the larger narrative of spiritual liberation from what many perceived as the oppressive authority of the Catholic Church. It's like a quiet, daring subplot that suddenly becomes a key part of the main historical blockbuster. The sheer audacity of their act inspired others. If these cloistered women, bound by solemn vows and thick stone walls, could find a way to break free,
What did that say about the power of conviction and the possibility of change for everyone else? The story became a living parable, a testament to the idea that deeply held beliefs could indeed lead to radical action. For Protestants, it was proof of God's favor, a clear sign that the old order was crumbling and a new, more authentic faith was emerging. For Catholics, it was an abomination, a scandalous betrayal of sacred vows, and a clear sign of the heretical nature of Luther's movement. But even for those who condemned it, the story was impossible to ignore. The image of the nuns hidden in herring barrels became an iconic, almost mythical representation of defiance and escape. It was both darkly humorous and deeply profound, highlighting the lengths to which individuals would go for their beliefs. It's the kind of story that gets told and retold, embellished slightly with each passing generation, cementing its place in the collective memory. This wasn't just a local incident. News of the escape spread through pamphlets and sermons, becoming a talking point in taverns and royal courts alike. People loved a good scandal, especially one that involved religious authority and a dash of fishy intrigue. The individual fates of the other 11 escaped nuns are less well documented than Katharina's, but many of them also found new lives, often marrying Lutheran pastors or scholars and raising families. Their collective act helped normalize the idea of former religious breaking their vows and integrating into secular society, which was a cornerstone of the Reformers' vision for a married clergy. Their lives, though perhaps quieter than Katharina's, collectively contributed to the shifting social landscape of Protestant Europe. It underscored the Reformation's impact not just on theology, but on fundamental social structures and individual lives. A mainstream historical fact is that the phenomenon of former nuns and monks marrying became a common, albeit often challenging, aspect of the early Reformation, actively encouraged by Luther and often facilitated by their communities. A quirky tidbit is that while the barrel escape is the most famous, there were other less dramatic instances of nuns quietly leaving convents as the Reformation gained ground, sometimes simply walking out when their superiors relaxed their vigilance. Historians still argue whether the romanticized versions of the escape, particularly the herring barrels, overshadow the deeper theological and social motivations that drove these women to risk everything. Regardless, the narrative of their courage and conviction endures. The legacy of their escape, particularly through Katharina's prominent life, became a living, breathing symbol of the profound changes sweeping across the European continent.
The tale of the nuns in the pickle barrels, with Katharina von Bora at its heart, transcends a mere historical anecdote. It endures as a powerful symbolism, a compelling narrative that continues to resonate far beyond the confines of 16th century Germany. It represents the profound human yearning for freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of choice, and freedom from imposed structures that no longer serve one's deepest convictions. It's a reminder that sometimes the most significant acts of rebellion aren't fought on battlefields, but in the quiet desperation of individuals seeking to live authentically. You can almost feel the resonance of their story whenever you encounter a tale of individuals defying overwhelming odds for a deeply held belief. It speaks to the universal struggle against oppression, whether it's religious, political, or social. The very image of women literally breaking out of confinement, albeit in an unconventional manner, captures an essence of human spirit that refuses to be eternally caged. It's like finding a tiny, resilient sapling pushing its way through concrete, a testament to life's insistent drive to grow. This story also highlights the often overlooked agency of women in history. In an era where women's lives were largely dictated by men, family, or the church, the Nimshan nuns collectively made a choice, initiated a plan, and risked everything for a different future. Katharina von Bora, in particular, showcases how a woman, even one stripped of traditional power, could, through intelligence, resilience, and a strategic marriage, become a foundational figure in a major historical movement. She wasn't just a passive recipient of Luther's help. She actively shaped her own destiny and, by extension, contributed to his. It's a compelling argument that history isn't just made by kings and generals, but also by the quiet fortitude of those who choose to defy.
The story also offers a lens through which to view the ripple effects of theological change. Luther's doctrines, initially abstract concepts, had very real, very tangible consequences for individuals, dismantling old institutions and opening up entirely new life paths. The dissolution of convents and monasteries across Protestant lands was a direct result of these doctrinal shifts, and the Nimschen escape was an early, vivid illustration of this broader trend. It reminds us that big ideas often have very human, very personal, and sometimes very smelly implications. Historians still argue about the precise balance between spiritual conviction and personal desire for freedom in the nuns' motivations. Was it purely a yearning for the pure Word of God, or was it also a yearning for marriage, family, and a life outside strictures? Perhaps it was an inseparable blend, as human motivation rarely fits into neat singular categories. This ongoing debate only adds to the richness of the story, inviting you to consider the complexities of individual choice within the vast sweep of historical forces. A quirky tidbit is that centuries later, the legend of the pickle barrel nuns was sometimes used in children's stories in Germany, as a tale of bravery and cleverness, perhaps without fully explaining the religious context. The enduring symbolism of their escape continues to be a source of fascination. It reminds you that sometimes the most extraordinary acts emerge from the most ordinary circumstances, and that a collective whisper can, with enough courage and ingenuity, become a resounding cry for freedom. As the quiet of the night deepens around you, let the remarkable journey of these women settle gently into your mind. From the echoing halls of a convent to the cramped, briny darkness of a herring barrel, and finally to the bustling streets of Wittenberg and a life transformed. Their story, a testament to the quiet strength of conviction and the unwavering pursuit of a life truly chosen, now fades into the gentle hum of history. Allow the distant echoes of their courage to mingle with your dreams, a soft reminder that even in the most unlikely of circumstances, profound change is always possible. Sleep well, and may your dreams be filled with quiet triumphs and the sweet scent of freedom.